So one of my favorite parts of being a Unitarian Universalist is hearing other people's stories about how they came to the faith. I couldn't find any statistical information on how many of us were born and raised as UUs, but I personally know only a few, which means there's a lot of great travel stories. And I'd like to share part of my travel story with you this morning. As a child, I was an unchurched person. My parents, though, were both raised in the Catholic Church, but had left the faith before I was born. My upbringing, however, was peppered with stories from their experiences. My mom attended Catholic schools her entire educational life, so we heard a lot of stories about nuns. My mom told us about how when she was an elementary student, her and her little classmates would save their change every week for the pagan babies. The nuns would gather the pennies and the nickels each week and tell their little students about how there were all these poor little children in the world who had not heard the word of God. And because, of course, they were all doomed. But the kids could help save pagan baby lives with their change. The money was actually gathered and given to the church to fund the missionaries who would then deliver the world and save those poor pagan babies. My dad left his Catholic schooling in the 8th grade. He said by then he had caught on to the racket that the church actually was. When the nuns tried to teach his class about how Jesus rose from the dead after the stone had been rolled in front of his tomb, my dad asked the head nun why some of Jesus' friends could not have come back in the night, bribed the guard, stole Jesus' body. For that, he got his knuckles bloodied with a ruler, and he never went back. His stories were mostly about the cruelty and the nonsense that the church embodied. So while I learned about religion, it was mostly through family lore and satire. My maternal grandparents would take my sister and I to Mass when we spent the night at their house, which I think actually happened twice in my life, but I did get some firsthand exposure. I was in 4th grade when my paternal grandmother passed away. The entire family attended a full Catholic funerary Mass, spoken almost entirely in Latin and Polish, which was my grandmother's native tongue. Didn't understand 2/3 of it. The eulogy, though, was presented in English, thankfully, but the straight from Poland priest must have made a translation error because he literally stood in the pulpit and said, "If Delphine can get into heaven, so can you." I don't know if he knew my grandmother that well, but the family attributes it to a translation error. When I was in middle school, I attended the local Methodist church. It definitely wasn't my parents' idea. And I wasn't going out of concern for my soul or even a curiosity about religion. See, I had started playing the flute in 5th grade in the school band, and the Methodists, the biggest church in town, had a youth band. As a flutist/band geek, I was lured in by the music. At some point, the elders pressed me to become a member of the church. And I clearly remember my parents telling me that while they were fine with me playing in the band, I was far too young to make such a decision as whether to join organized religion or not. The Methodists actually disbanded the youth band shortly after that, and I can only guess that it's because they realized they were attracting band geeks and not future parishioners. During the same time frame, my dad worked for a company that was attempting to bring external combustion engines into the mainstream. The internal combustion engine, which is what you have in your car, is the gold standard of horsepower, so to speak. The external combustion engine, which is called a Stirling engine after the inventor, boasts the ability to burn as fuel basically anything that will burn. My dad had built a working display where you could put your sandwich in the hopper and the engine would go, because it would burn the sandwich up. As part of the marketing for the Stirling engine, the company, which was also called Stirling, had a full-size, well-appointed Winnebago RV. Anytime you operated the internal mechanisms of the coach, like the microwave or the pumps that ran water to the shower, the sinks, the Stirling engine provided that power, and they used this at trade shows. Part of my dad's job was to drive the Winnebago to those trade shows and to be there in case anything went wrong with the Stirling engine. One of these trade shows was in the Deep South, which was probably kind of like Georgia, but we lived in Michigan, so everything was the Deep South. We loaded up Winnie and we drove to Atlanta, Georgia, where my dad dropped myself and my sister and my mother off to stay with my aunt while he went to the trade show, which I don't even remember where that was. And my Aunt Margaret has always been something of a legend in my mind. She was the first child on my mother's side to go to college. She married a man while she was in college, and when she divorced him just a few years later, I got the impression it caused something of a kerfuffle in the family. I was very young when this happened, but I clearly remember my mother trying to explain to my sister and I about how Uncle Rob wasn't going to be our uncle anymore. She seemed very concerned about how my younger sister and I were going to take this news. I don't remember Uncle Rob at all, to tell you the truth, and I was pretty unfazed by the news of whatever this divorce thing was. Aunt Margaret later decided that her initial degree wasn't serving her well, and she went back to school and became a lawyer. A very, very good lawyer, as a matter of fact. She had an office at the top of a building in downtown Atlanta. She had a 3-story house and a full-time nanny/housekeeper that lived on the first floor. These were all elements of a lifestyle I had never seen or heard of real people having before. So Aunt Margaret was quite the exotic specimen of how a woman could live her life. I was always thrilled to go to Aunt Margaret's house. On one of these trips to Atlanta, Aunt Margaret took us to eat at the Hard Rock Cafe. I know these are everywhere now, right? But back in the 80s, you didn't see one at every major tourist destination. I think the one at Atlanta may have been only the second or the third in the United States. I remember sitting in the booth, trying to see every little bit of memorabilia that was on the walls. Remember, I was a band geek. On the way out, Aunt Margaret bought a button for me, the kind you pin on your super cool denim Levi's jacket in the 80s, with one of the Hard Rock Cafe's mottos, love all, serve all. I still have it. The Hard Rock Cafe still uses this motto to this day. I remember thinking at the time that love all, serve all was radical. I mean, it's so simple, but so profound. I'm sure the adults around me saw it as marketing. Nobody brought it up. There was no deep conversation about it, but it struck me in a way that I could not explain at the time. And for a long time, I had secretly adopted love all, serve all as my personal mantra, which I didn't want to say out loud because everybody would think I was just parroting for the Hard Rock Cafe. And I loved it, even before I had even heard of Unitarian Universalism. So maybe it was my lack of formal religious education that primed me to find this message in the marketing of a casual dining restaurant chain. But part of what drew me to Unitarian Universalism was the 6 sources. To me, the sources essentially say that inspiration and truth are all around us in many forms and from many places. But the sources aren't, in word anyway, quite that open. 4 of the 6 refer to religions or teachings. One of the sources refers to words and deeds of prophetic people. The first listed source, my favorite, describes the direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures. When I think of culture in this sense, I think of the traditional definition, the customs, arts, social institutions, and achievements of a particular nation, people, or other social group. Can a corporation be a people or a social group? While doing research, I found a corporate social responsibility report that Hard Rock International published. It says in part, and I'm quoting, social purpose is at the core of Hard Rock International and Seminole Gaming. For the past 50 years, hard rock has been guided by 4 founding mottos: love all, serve all is one, save the planet, and take time to be kind. When the Seminole Tribe of Florida acquired Hard Rock International in March of 2007, it fused unparalleled service across cafes, hotels, and casinos with a commitment to serving local communities and gaining trust on measurable action. Hard Rock and Seminole Gaming operate more than 250 cafes, hotels, and casinos spanning 67 countries. And with that comes a responsibility to support local communities all over the world. This was published last year at their 50th anniversary. Now, this sounds like a manifesto UUs could get behind, especially on those 4 founding mottos: love all, serve all is one, save the planet, take time to be kind. It's kind of like UU Light, right? If you believe online resources, such as Glassdoor, Hard Rock cafes are a good place to work. People feel treated fairly. The management scores range from good to great, and the only complaint is the nature of the work: long hours and physically demanding. But they're a restaurant chain, so that's kind of to be expected. I would not think that's out of the ordinary. So it sounds like, as a company, Hard Rock Cafe is living up to those 4 mottos. Now, Hard Rock International, including the cafes, the hotels, and the casinos, employs more than 10,000 people worldwide. The Seminole Tribe of Florida is just over 2,000 people. We recognize the Seminoles as having a culture, their culture. The Seminoles bought the Hard Rock entity 30 years after Hard Rock was incorporated, so we can state pretty assuredly that those founding mottos didn't come from the Seminoles. Do we? Should we recognize a corporation's culture as a source for inspiration and truth? As an adult, I wonder if this one little button didn't lay the groundwork for my future adoption of Unitarian Universalism. This little button also makes me ask myself, where else are there messages that I'm missing because they look like advertising? Or what am I missing because it doesn't look like a message? Buffalo Springfield's song, for what it's worth, is one of my favorite songs. Partly because I love a good protest song. Who doesn't? And partly because it's one of the first songs I remember as a kid hearing and understanding the words to it. The song is not about what most people think it's about, though. And here's the explanation that I stole from Wikipedia. Although, for what it's worth, it's often considered an anti-war song, Stephen Stills was inspired to write the song because of the Sunset Strip curfew riots in Los Angeles in November of '66, when a series of early counterculture era clashes took place between police and young people on the Sunset Strip in Hollywood, California, the same year that Buffalo Springfield became the house band at Whiskey A Go-Go. Local residents and businesses had become annoyed at how crowds of young people going to clubs and music venues along the Strip had caused late-night traffic congestion. Oh, those young people. In response, they lobbied Los Angeles County to pass local ordinances stopping loitering and enforce a strict curfew on the Strip of 10 p.m. The young music fans, however, felt their new laws infringed upon their civil rights. And on Saturday, November 12th of 1966, flyers were distributed inviting people to join demonstrations later that day. And that evening, as many as 1,000 young demonstrators, including future celebrities such as Jack Nicholson and Peter Fonda, gathered to protest the curfew's enforcement. And although the rallies began peacefully, trouble eventually broke out. The unrest continued the next night and periodically throughout the rest of November and December, forcing some clubs to shut down within weeks. It was against this backdrop of the civil disturbances that Stills recorded For What It's Worth in December of 1966. The part of the message that speaks to me in that song is part of that third verse. 1,000 people in the streets, singing songs and carrying signs, mostly say, "Hooray for our side." It's a great visual of what a protest looks like, and I grew up in Michigan in the 80s. I had no idea what protests looked like. But what I learned from those lyrics was that isolating yourself among people who only think like you do is not a good thing. You can stand up for yourself. and your beliefs and protest all you want. But when we shut out messages from outside our own culture, we commit a grave error. We invite fear into our lives. Like the song says, step out of the line, the man come and take you away. Our UU sources reference cultures in the noun form, but it only seems fair to recognize that culture can also be used as a verb. Definition: to maintain in conditions suitable to growth, such as to culture cancer cells, or to culture buttermilk, which is a much friendlier image in my mind. Or yogurt. I love yogurt. Living in an environment suitable to growth means you can be cultured. If we can look beyond our own restrictions of what we define suitable environment as, if we can see past that definition of culture, the noun, the institutions, the achievements of a set of people, perhaps we can find wisdom and knowledge and guidance right in front of us. I do love this button. It's a great keepsake from my childhood that actually helped form my adult self. And from my brief time hanging out with the Methodists, Hebrews 13-2 has stuck with me. And it reads, "Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." So let us widen our definition of stranger, and maybe we can actually find some of those angels. Thank you.